Georgia versus Florida has been pegged by many as a potential game to watch for an upset. Is that the case? Does Florida have a chance? If they do, how do they? And what weaknesses could they exploit in a seemingly invincible Georgia team? Or is Georgia just going to roll? Well, I hope to answer that question today. And now, with the intro out of the way, I'd like to say hello and welcome to the JSA studio. And today, we are going to be previewing and predicting Georgia versus Florida. But before we officially get started, I would like to ask you to like, comment, and subscribe. Go ahead and tell me your prediction for this game in the comment section down below. And then at the end of the video, maybe go back and see if I convinced you that you were right or maybe changed your mind. The first thing that we're going to do is talk about the context and some of the things surrounding the game, as well as a few of the narratives heading into it. The first and foremost one of that is, of course, the Brock Bowers injury. He is likely out for the final 4 games of the regular season. I could see him coming back for the SEC championship game, but if he isn't there for the SEC championship game, he will almost certainly be back by the time you get to the college football playoffs potentially, or a bowl game. And the fact of the matter is that nobody really knows what this offense is going to look like without Brock Bowers, because he's never really been gone for a significant period of time before. Now, the injury did kind of happen at like the perfect time, because you've got 2 weeks to game plan for a Brock Bowers-less offense. So I guess that's somewhat of an upside that you could look at. But when it comes down to it, we just don't know what the offense will look like. I think it'll be fine. I think it'll be less tight end centric. I actually think you'll probably focus more on getting the ball down the field rather than, matriculating the ball down the field. I think you'll see more designed deep shots out of the offense. I think you'll see Carson Beck having to navigate the pocket maybe a little bit more because the safety blanket isn't there. I think you'll probably see him extending plays as well, all of which he is capable of doing at a high level. We haven't really seen it so much out of him this year. We've seen it in bits and pieces. They haven't really needed him to play above his means yet, and I'm not entirely sure he will absolutely have to for this game, but if he does need to do that, then I believe that he will show that he is capable of doing that even without Brock Bowers. I think Rosemary Jack Saint is a really, really good wide receiver. I think he's a day 2 pick. I think Lovett and Thomas are solid options, and you still have plenty of talent in the tight end group to go along with a dominant offensive line. So I don't think the offense will take that big of a step back, but it will take a step back. You don't lose maybe the best player in all of college football and have the offense still be at the same level that it was beforehand. Another contextual thing, which is somewhat odd but not unheard of, it happens a couple of times every year, is that we have the double byes. Both Georgia and Florida are coming off of a bye. Hypothetically, it would be an advantage if one team was coming off of a bye and another team wasn't, but I'm not actually sure if that is an advantage or a disadvantage, because you're kind of thinking about things a little bit too much. And there are teams that can get caught up with that coming off of the bye week, and they actually come out sluggish instead of more prepared. So maybe that could be a factor for both of these teams. It might not be the sharpest football you've ever seen in the first quarter, but ultimately I don't think either team is gaining an advantage from the bye week. And the last contextual thing that I want to talk about is that this could potentially be what I refer to as a program building win for Florida. I think Florida is going to come to play. It's at home. I think the Swamp is going to be bouncing, and I think Florida is going to be playing very hard. And I think that's why the spread and the over-under are where they are. I think the odds makers are giving Florida a little bit of a bump here because it's at home and because they're both coming off of the bye and because this is Florida's chance to have a statement win and build a program under Billy Napier. So I think that's why the over-under and the spread is where it is. The spread is, of course, Florida plus 14.5, and the over-under is 48.5, meaning I think it's probably going to be a little bit of a lower scoring game, and I actually disagree with that. I think it's not going to be a defensive football game at all. And a main reason for that is the play of the quarterbacks. Carson Beck and Graham Mertz have both far exceeded expectations, in my opinion. I think they have played better than I think anybody expected them to play this year, specifically Graham Mertz. I did not see this level of play out of him at all. He's been pretty decent. He's been solid this year, but Carson Beck has been on a different level than Graham Mertz. I think Graham Mertz has kind of pushed himself into maybe I'm a 7th round draft pick or a camp arm sort of situation. Carson Beck, I think, if he returns and goes out in 2025, will be in the 1st round quarterback discussion. And it's because of that and the difference in talent between the two, in my opinion, and the obvious difference in level of play so far this season, that I'm going to give the edge in this position battle, so to speak, to Georgia. I think this one's pretty clear cut. Graham Mertz has been good this year, but Carson Beck is just in a different stratosphere. Moving on to the running backs and the offensive line. This one I also think is pretty clear cut. I was actually impressed with the Florida offensive line, specifically their center, Jake Slaughter. He has been really, really good. But there is a bigger gap between Florida's offensive line and Georgia's offensive line than there is between Graham Mertz and Carson Beck. And that's a pretty sizable gap. Florida's offensive line is okay. It's solid. It's decent for a Power 5 program. They have one standout player and no liabilities. But Georgia's offensive line is a top 3 unit in the country. Now, the running backs are a bit of a different story. I think as a running back group, Georgia is really good and they're very deep, but Florida is also fairly deep, and I actually think better at the top than Georgia. I love Edwards for Georgia. I love him. I think he's somebody who's going to get drafted in the 4th or 5th round and make a GM look like an absolute genius for picking him. I love Edwards. But Trevor Etienne is better than Edwards, and when you're talking about RB2s, Montrell Johnson is very solid as well. So as a running back group, I would give Florida the slight edge, but the offensive line still puts this whole overall group, running backs and offensive line, basically the running game as a whole, is in Georgia's favor by a fairly large margin. And the wide receivers and tight ends, or the skill positions as I will sometimes call them, is pretty much the exact same story. I think Ricky Pearsall is the best individual talent and the best individual player of the whole group. However, the next 5 guys on the list are all Georgia players. I would put Ricky Pearsall at 1. I would then put Rosemary Jack-Saint at 2, probably Lovett at 3, Ra Thomas at 4, and so on. So I think it's pretty much the same story as it was with the offensive line and running backs. Florida may have the best individual player, in my opinion, but Georgia has the far better group. Now, the front 7 was the hardest group to come to a decision on, and that was mainly because of how underwhelming in the pass rush Georgia's front 7 has been this year. Now, they've been dominant against the run, and they will continue to be dominant against the run. But Florida, I think, has actually had a better and more consistent pass rush than Georgia this year. That doesn't mean that Georgia can't turn it on when it, quote, matters most, unquote, but I haven't seen it so far this year out of them. The defensive line has been tremendously disappointing, especially when compared to the level of play that they've had the past 2 seasons. Meanwhile, Florida's defensive line has exceeded expectations, in my opinion. I don't particularly think anybody coming into this season thought that Florida would be 5-2 at this point and would have one of the better pass rushing units in all of college football. I mean, most people that I remember had Florida going either 5-7 or 6-6, and Florida has a fairly realistic pathway to 8 wins. They really only need to upset an LSU team that can't play defense, a Missouri team that can't play defense, or a Florida State team that can't play defense. So I think it's fairly realistic that they could get one of those 3 games along with beating Arkansas to get them to that 8-4 mark. So I think this could be a pretty successful season for Florida, and a main reason for that would be their ability to rush the passer. However, when you're talking about just the defensive lines, the linebacking core is disappointing for Florida. That has been probably their biggest individual position group weakness, in my opinion, so far this season. And it hasn't been great for Georgia either. I think the defensive line, because of how dominant they've been in the run game, is a better overall unit than Georgia's linebackers. And Georgia's linebackers haven't really been good either, but they have been better than Florida's linebackers. I think Florida's linebackers have been bad. I think Georgia's linebackers have been average to okay. So once again, I'm going to give the edge in the front 7 category to Georgia. And when it comes to the defensive backs, we're once again back to not even a conversation levels of dichotomy. Georgia has, in my opinion, the best secondary in the country. And I don't even particularly think it's really close. I don't think anybody is in their league when it comes to the level that Georgia's secondary has played at this year. Florida's secondary has been good. I think they've had a good defensive line and a good secondary. But it is not on the same level as Georgia's. And that's kind of been a theme throughout this whole positional breakdown and comparison section of this video, where Florida has some good players, maybe even the best player in an individual grouping, but Georgia just has so much more talent, and they're so much more consistent with their talent right now than Florida. Now, Florida, I think, with the way that they're recruiting, could potentially be a team in a year or two that could maybe more legitimately compare to Georgia in terms of talent, but I don't think they'll ever be able to catch Georgia in terms of just straight up talent, because Georgia is still likely going to pull in the number 1 recruiting class this year, and they've had the number 1 recruiting class the past 2 years as well. So even though Florida has probably a top 5 class in the country when it's all said and done, there's just a different level that Georgia is at right now. The last thing we're going to talk about before we get into the actual prediction that I have for this game is the matchups, because when you're comparing positions to each other, like quarterback to quarterback or defensive line to defensive line, etc., they don't actually play each other, so it doesn't particularly matter if one side has a better group than the other side. What actually matters is how they match up against each other. So we're taking the Georgia quarterback versus the entire Florida defense, because the quarterback plays the entire defense, and I'm going to give that edge to Georgia. And I'm going to take the Georgia running backs and offensive line versus Florida's front 7 as well. I'm also going to take Georgia's skill versus Florida's back 7. I'm also going to take Georgia's defense over Florida's quarterback, and Georgia's front 7 over Florida's offensive line and running backs, and Georgia's back 7 over Florida's skill position players. I think this game is a total mismatch in terms of talent, in terms of level of play, and my prediction for this game is going to reflect that. My official prediction for this game is Georgia 45, Florida 24. What stood out most to me when I was watching film of Florida is the fact that their defense is not nearly as good as the statistics might imply that they are. It might be because of the poor level of play from the linebackers. It might be because even though they have individually talented players, they don't particularly play well as a unit. And I just think that this Florida team is outmatched and outgunned in just about every single way that you could possibly be outmatched and outgunned. I don't particularly have a whole lot to say about this, other than I think that the dogs roll in this game. And unfortunately, that is all that I have for you today. So it's at this point that I'm going to go ahead and remind you to like if you liked the video, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if you disagreed with me at any point in the video, or if you just have something to say, go ahead and drop a comment down in the comment section below. Let's just keep it civil. After all, what do I know? I'm just some asshole on the internet giving you his opinion. I'll see you next time.